Back now to our top story on the battles being waged over broadband and media regulation. Communications Minister Stephen Conroy joined me in the studio just a short time ago. Stephen Conroy, thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you, Tony.
Now, you're putting a brave face on it, but the NBN cost blowout and the construction delays could prove disastrous for the network, couldn't they?
Look, not at all. Firstly, let me deal with this issue of delays. The Telstra deal took 9 months longer than we forecast for a start date. That was a perfectly reasonable debate. Telstra were out to maximise the position for their shareholders, and Mike Quigley and the NBN team wanted to get value for money for taxpayers. So this took 9 months longer than forecast. So when we started, it was 9 months later. If you look at the actual rollout schedule since then, we're pretty much on schedule. So the delays due to the Telstra deal, we've been saying this for over a year. Now, in terms of the construction forecasts, we said back in February, and Malcolm Turnbull said, I'm going to hold you to this. We said 758,000 homes under construction or completed by December this year, and we are on target to meet that.
OK, but look, we'll go into the details in a moment, but any sort of delay bumps you up against the effective deadline of the end of next year, which is when an election will be held, and the coalition is basically threatening to scrap the network or at least freeze it in place. So you could end up with a certain part of the country with the NBN and the rest of the country with no NBN. So from your point of view, any delay could be disastrous for the network. That is what I meant.
Well, the NBN has never been about one election. We said from the day we announced it, this is a 9 to 10 year build. This is about putting in place the infrastructure this country needs for the next 30, 40, 50 years. This was never going to be built in a way that could be used as an election carrot. This is being built over 10 years. We've said that from day one, and we are on target. Despite that 9-month delay, NBN Co will still deliver a completion date only 6 months after the originally announced completion date.
But the effective deadline that I'm talking about of an election is a serious one. You must have it in your mind. Do you know where the NBN will be at? How many homes throughout the country will be attached to the NBN by the end of next year, which is when the election will be?
Well, if it's on
time, if it's not earlier.
The forecast for June 30 next year is around 40 to 50,000 users. The proposed amount of homes that we have passed is about 250,000. But let me be clear, this was never about an election. The National Broadband Network is a vital piece of infrastructure that will deliver the next generation of health services, the next generation of education services, the next generation of aged care services, and I could go on and on with the vital piece of infrastructure.
But it will only do that if it's continued, if the build continues, and if the if a coalition government stops the build, where is it at?
Look, Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull have made it clear they will stop the build when they find out the final dates for those contracts. Now, those contracts are not all in place at this point in time. The construction contracts are due for renewal towards the end of this year. We have got contracts for the 2 new satellites that will deliver the next generation of broadband to the furthest, remotest 7% of Australia's population. We're building an upgradable fixed wireless network, 2 satellites, to service that 7%. Where the construction contracts are up to, well, Malcolm Turnbull and Tony Abbott have said they will stop. So people shouldn't think that Malcolm Turnbull's joking, that Tony Abbott's joking. They're going to sabotage the National Broadband Network. They're going to put a halt to it, and then they're going to build a second-rate network.
But can you stop that effectively by creating contracts which go well into the future beyond whatever next government there is?
Look, it will be irresponsible for the NBN. It's not the government negotiating these contracts. It will be irresponsible of the NBN to, for instance, lock in another 8-year construction contract. That just would not be a commercial negotiation. Mike Quigley and the board, and this is a board that contains some very serious business figures in this country. This is a board that isn't going to enter into a contract that isn't commercial. So I don't believe they would consider entering into an 8 to 9 year contract. I think they'll be very sensible. They've entered into 2-year contracts so far. They're up for any negotiation. But what contracts they ultimately negotiate will be down to what sort of price they get. I mean, Mike Quigley and the team at NBN Co have been absolutely rigorous in ensuring that Australian taxpayers get value for money.
Well, you've been listening to some of the projections. $200 a month is one that's been widely used for what it's going to cost an average home to be on the NBN. True or not true?
Absolutely false.
So what will it be?
Cheapest plan,
what will it be?
The cheapest plan in the marketplace today, this is on offer today. Australians have, using this offer today, is $29.95 from a company called SkyMesh. You can get a $25.95. Now, line rental today is $33, $34 to most Australians. So this is a price below line rental before you add your broadband in. So you can get the cheapest entry-level prices of just on $30 right now today in the marketplace. This $200 Tony Abbott figure and Malcolm Turnbull have all claimed it. This is a completely misleading and false claim.
Let's go back to the details of the cost blowout. You've had a 3.9% increase in capital expenditure costs. An extra $1.4 billion will be necessary. And according to Mr Turnbull, the government will have to kick in an extra $2.9 billion. Do you accept those figures?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. What we've seen is a number of transactions that took place since the last forecast. Back in 2010, we hadn't done the Optus deal. The Optus deal means we're connecting 500,000 customers that we weren't expecting, and we're connecting them sooner than anybody could possibly have projected. So what we're seeing is a pull-through. We're having to spend more capital up front because of this Optus deal. But what this does is it increases the rate of return for the NBN Co, and that means that the taxpayers will get their money back, every cent the government's spending plus interest, and a modest return from the national broadband network. So that's what the Optus deal represents. There's more cash up front, but longer term, the rate of return is absolutely increased.
All right, Mr Turnbull's leapt all over these new figures today, though, as evidence, he says, of mismanagement. And today he's especially targeted a $4 billion blowout in the budget for indirect operating expenses, staff costs, he says. Is this figure correct?
Well, the Joint Parliamentary Committee, of which Malcolm Turnbull is on, unanimously said, we want you to do more to communicate to Australians what the National Broadband Network's about. So NBN Co takes Malcolm Turnbull and that committee's advice, puts on more people to explain and communicate what the NBN's about, and Malcolm Turnbull turns around and criticises.
Well, $4 billion worth of extra staff, is that what you're saying? Seriously, that is a rather large wage bill.
The NBN is forecast to build up to about 3,000 plus workers, and then after the main build phase, it phases back down. Malcolm Turnbull there is gathering together a 10-year figure. I mean, he's just...
Sure, but to take his point, if the extra costs are about people communicating the benefits of the NBN, that's rather a large wage bill for communicators, for public affairs people.
The total cost of the CapEx build is 3.9%, $1.4 billion net figure. So what you're seeing is the Optus deal. You're seeing purchasing more what we call build drop. We're actually building now right to the wall, the side of the house. So we're buying more fibre. We've also bought more fibre for the overall backhaul transit network. So what you're seeing is absolutely cost. We've made savings in the purchasing of equipment. So there's ups and downs in this figure. And for Malcolm Turnbull to try and pluck one figure just shows how desperate he is. It's a 3.9% increase. I don't know anybody who describes a 3.9% increase as a blowout, but Malcolm Turnbull's had to grasp one figure, ignore all the rest, don't look at the total overall figure, just pick one and make an absurd claim about it.
Let's move on to other issues. There's been news today of a Facebook page which includes racist slogans, comments and jokes about Indigenous Australians. You want it taken down. Facebook is resisting taking it down. Can you do more?
Well, firstly, Facebook, after the initial outcry yesterday, took it down last night. The host, or the supplier of the page, then changed its classification and has called it controversial humour, and Facebook are saying we don't adjudicate.
Is it still racist in your opinion?
Look, I think it's absolutely inappropriate. I think it should be taken down. Facebook should take this site down. What I do understand, though, in late breaking news, Tony, is that a number of the offensive pictures have been taken down by the person involved in producing this, but I'm not sure that goes far enough. I think that this page should be taken out by Facebook. We don't live by American laws here in Australia. We live by Australian laws, and this is an Australian who's using the fact that Facebook is based in the US to get away from Australian laws. This is
16-year-old Australian, apparently.
I've heard that.
If that's true, that's pretty sophisticated for a 16-year-old to get around the Racial Discrimination Act in Australia.
Well, look, I understand there have been a number of complaints made today. There's been references to the ACMA. So I'm pleased to see that people are taking up this case here in Australia. We've had a lot of debate and discussion with Facebook. They've now finally employed an employee here in Australia. We're in conversations with that employee. Our views are being strongly made to Facebook in the US, but at the end of the day, it's a US company operating under US law.
Does that mean the Australian government has no power to take this site down, even if it is generated in Australia and is generating racist material?
Well, in the past, there's been a whole range of pages, not just on Facebook, but on other sites, where people have made complaints. We've gone to the courts. The courts have issued notices. The police have gone to enforce them over in the US, and in the past, we've got nowhere. Now, I have to say, the police are doing a great job here. They're trying to deal with these issues, and there's a lot better cooperation between the Googles and the Facebooks than there's been in the past. But here's a case where I think they're really not doing the right thing, and they should take it down.
All right, Tony Abbott fired his first shots this week in what he calls the freedom wars. Now, what are your thoughts, first of all, on the Voltaire statement, which he is adopting? I disapprove of what you say, but will defend to my death your right to say it.
Well, the Racial Discrimination Act has a whole range of rights also. And what you have here is competing rights. A right to free speech, but a right not to be bullied, harassed, intimidated and abused. And these are two rights that clash together. And in a civilised society like Australia, a healthy debate about where that balance falls is a good thing. But to suddenly suggest, as Tony Abbott seems to be, that there should be no restrictions on speech is not something that is traditionally an Australian perspective.
Well, in fact, the particular reference is to Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, under which Andrew Bolt was convicted last year. And Mr Abbott calls this the hurt feelings law, and he's promised to repeal it. What effect would that have?
Well, the court made a judgment in the Bolt case. I'm not in a position to comment on it. I'm not aware of all of the legal ramifications, but that was an interpretation where Mr Bolt was found to be in breach of the Act. Each case is taken on a case-by-case basis. And whether or not Mr Abbott is correct that this needs to be just completely repealed could open the floodgates for a whole range of other circumstances to arise. So this is something that should be debated, but at this stage we don't believe this section needs to be repealed.
All right, Mr Abbott's also promising to oppose a new media regulator, should you have one, along the lines suggested by Judge Finkelstein, which he maintains would be used against broadcasters like Andrew Bolt and Alan Jones in Sydney.
Well, Alan Jones is already fully supervised by 100% funded government regulator called the ACMA. Government funded 100%. So Alan Jones is not caught any more than he's already caught by Mr Abbott's claim. It was just false. Andrew Bolt, being in the print industry, is not regulated currently by the ACMA. And what
he's in both. He's now broadcaster, radio, television and...
Andrew Bolt's statements on his television program are currently regulated by a 100% government-funded entity, the ACMA. But print consider themselves to be separate. They consider themselves to be different. They've got a much longer tradition. And so what we have in Australia is traditionally a press council that has been a poodle.
Well, so are you still then proposing to set up a new media council, which is what I think Finkelstein calls it, with the power to set journalistic standards and enforce news standards?
Well, let me be clear. The government has received two reports, one from Justice Finkelstein, one from the Convergence Review. They've got conflicting opinions to the government. The government is considering them at the moment. We have not made any decision at this stage.
Yes, but I'm not asking what the decision will be, but what are your thoughts as to where it should go?
I think these two worthy opinions to us. I've argued for some time the Press Council has not had sufficient power, been not funded, and is voluntary if the media proprietors want to flout it. So I've been consistently arguing we need a stronger Press Council. And to be fair to Julian Disney and the Press Council, they've recently substantially increased funding, substantially increased staff, and substantially been taking a more proactive position. Does it go far enough? That's all of the things that are in the mix for us at the moment. But do I think that the previous Press Council was sufficient? Absolutely not.
Well, the plans to regulate the print media have been linked to comments that you made arguing that News Limited is campaigning actively against the Gillard government. Firstly, do you still maintain that is the case?
Well, I think there's certainly been a better balance over the last few months. The News Limited papers still are strident, but that's their job.
You think they responded to your complaints? Is that what you're saying?
I think the Daily Telegraph was taken to the Press Council by a citizen I've never met, never heard of until after the case was. It found that the Daily Telegraph, in 3 cases in quick succession, were not a fair and balanced representation of the debate around the National Broadband Network. So I think following that judgment back in December, there has been a toning down of the blatant lack of balance which I have been pointing to consistently. So the debate about News Limited is a genuine debate, but I think there's been a better balance, particularly since Kim Williams has taken over at News Limited. I think there's a better balance. That's not to say they're giving the government a free run. They're certainly not. There's plenty still to be debated about.
Okay, but just to sort of wind this up, really, could you really imagine the Cabinet taking on the big media interests in print in Australia in a lead up to the next election by putting in place a really powerful new regulator with teeth?
I can certainly see us wanting a regulator with more teeth. We are not satisfied. We weren't satisfied with the way the Press Council was behaving. We weren't satisfied with the lack of teeth, the lack of follow-up that was going on at the Press Council. There have been improvements. We're now considering where the balance is. We've got conflicting advice in the Cabinet. The Parliament will ultimately get to make a decision on that.
But is the political will there in the lead up to an election to take on big media interests?
I think there's a political will to get a far, far better outcome than this country has had before.
Stephen Conroy, we'll have to leave you there. Thank you very much for coming in to talk to us tonight.
Good to be with you, Tony.